Hey everyone, and welcome to your personalized deep dive. Today we're tackling something you specifically wanted to explore, and that is how to manage those low moods and really get a grip on your emotions. We'll be using the book Why Has Nobody Told Me This Before by Dr. Julie Smith. And for anyone who doesn't know, she's a clinical psychologist who has kind of blown up on TikTok.
TikTok and therapy, yeah. That's not something I would have seen coming a few years back. But it's really awesome to see that information about mental health is reaching people in new ways.
Totally. What I really like about Dr. Smith is that she keeps things super practical. She skips all the complicated jargon and just gives you those solid skills, the kind you might learn in therapy, but are actually useful in everyday life. And right away, her explanation of how feelings are actually created really resonated with me. She uses this analogy about dehydration.
Oh, yeah. It's such a smart way to illustrate that our feelings aren't just all in our heads. Like, we all know that being dehydrated makes us feel cranky and tired.
Right.
Even before we consciously feel thirsty, Dr. Smith uses this to illustrate a much bigger point, which is that our emotions are actually made up of a whole bunch of different factors. Not just brain chemicals, but internal and external stuff too.
So it's like our emotions are this puzzle, and the pieces come from our body, our thoughts, our relationships, even things like sleep and what we eat.
That's it. She calls this the cross-sectional formulation. It's really fascinating because it means we actually have a lot more control over our mood than we might think.
Okay, so that's good news. But then there's that chapter on instant relief, that urge to just zone out with social media, TV, or maybe grab a snack when we're feeling down. I think we've all been there at some point. Have you ever felt that urge?
Oh, totally. Dr. Smith isn't saying we can't enjoy those things, of course, but it's when we start relying on them as our main way to cope that things can actually backfire and make our mood worse in the long run.
So it's like a quick fix that ends up making things worse.
Yeah, exactly. Think of it this way. Every time we choose that quick fix, we're strengthening the neural pathways in our brain, making it a habit. It becomes our automatic go-to. And that can keep us stuck in this negative cycle.
Almost like our brain is working against us, huh? And speaking of things that work against us, Dr. Smith talks about these sneaky thought patterns and these biases that can actually make low moods even worse.
You mentioned feeling anxious about public speaking before, right? And you said you'd gotten some really great feedback on a presentation, but there was one tiny critique, and that's all you could think about. It's a classic example of what she calls mental filtering.
Ugh, yes. It's like that one negative comment completely overshadowed all the good ones.
Yeah, our brains have this built-in negativity bias. We're hardwired to focus on the negative, unfortunately. Dr. Smith says recognizing these patterns when they happen is the first step to breaking free.
So we have to catch ourselves in the act.
That's the key. Instead of getting totally swept away by those thoughts, we can pause, label them, and then, question whether they're actually true or not.
Got it. So we've talked about some of the pitfalls, those things that can make a low mood even worse. But Dr. Smith doesn't just leave us hanging there, right? She gives us this whole toolkit of strategies that can actually help.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
One thing that really stood out to me was her emphasis on getting some distance from those difficult emotions. You're big into hitting the gym, right? Well, think of mindfulness and meditation as a workout for your mind.
Okay, I'm willing to give it a shot. What about when I'm stuck in that thought spiral, the one she calls rumination? That feeling of being trapped in this washing machine of negative thoughts, going over the same worries again and again. I bet you've been there too.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. One of the simplest but most powerful tips in the book is this question: what would I do if I was at my best?
Oh, that's interesting. It's not about forcing ourselves to feel amazing right now, but about shifting that focus to action instead.
Exactly. When we're ruminating, we often end up feeling paralyzed,
right?
Stuck. But this question helps us break free from that and take a step towards a solution, even a small one. And, you mentioned that you feel most fulfilled when you're actively working towards your goals, right?
Yeah, that's true. Taking action and making progress does make me feel better.
So even taking a tiny step, as long as it's in line with your values, it's a huge win against that low mood.
This all reminds me of another important point. She talks about being kinder to ourselves. How we can be so much harder on ourselves than we would ever be on anyone else.
For sure. Remember you were saying you'd never talk to a friend the way you sometimes talk to yourself?
Oh, absolutely not. If my friend messed up, I'd be supportive and understanding. But with myself, it's just criticism and judgment.
Dr. Smith has this great exercise. Imagine someone saying those same harsh things you say to yourself, but to themselves. how would you respond to them?
Oh, I'd be way more compassionate and understanding, that's for sure. It's like we have this double standard for ourselves.
It's so true. And that's where self-compassion comes in. It's not about letting ourselves off the hook,
Uh-huh.
but about giving ourselves the same kindness we'd give to a friend.
That makes so much sense, especially when I think about my goal of managing emotions. Self-compassion feels like a really important piece of the puzzle.
It really is. It gives us the strength and resilience to face those tough feelings. And speaking of strength and resilience, Dr. Smith talks about these main defenses for good mental health. Things you've probably heard before: sleep, nutrition, routine, social connection.
Yeah, those sound pretty familiar. But how do they fit into all of this, managing our emotions?
Think of it like building your immune system. These things won't magically cure low mood or anxiety, but they make you more resilient. It's like having this strong defense system ready to fight off those emotional viruses.
Love that analogy. So it's more about consistent effort, not about being perfect.
Exactly. And remember how you were saying you really hate going to the gym? Well, Dr. Smith says that exercise doesn't have to be this chore. It's about finding movement that you actually enjoy. That alone can change your brain chemistry, make you more motivated.
Okay, so we've covered quite a bit already, right? We talked about how feelings are formed, all those traps we can fall into, and some really powerful tools for dealing with a low mood. But there's one more thing I want to touch on before we move on.
What's that?
It's this idea of having a better vocabulary for our emotions. Dr. Smith actually suggests we need more nuanced words than just happy or sad.
Oh, that's where it gets really interesting. Research actually shows that being able to pinpoint specific feelings, like saying frustrated instead of just bad, actually helps us regulate them better.
So it's like having a more precise set of tools to understand what's going on inside us.
Precisely. And this actually leads us to how Dr. Smith approaches big life changes, which, you mentioned you're considering. She emphasizes the importance of metacognition. It sounds complicated, but it's basically just becoming more aware of how we think.
Okay, so it's like thinking about our own thinking.
Exactly. And she suggests journaling, even if it's just your messy thoughts, to help spot patterns. What events, thoughts, feelings, actions are all playing into the situation you want to change.
That's a good idea. I've tried journaling before, but I never thought of it like that, as a way to analyze my thought patterns.
It can be really eye-opening, for sure. It helps us make more conscious choices instead of just reacting on autopilot.
That's awesome. Speaking of things that can be tough to face, let's talk about grief. I know you mentioned dealing with a loss recently, and Dr. Smith dedicates a whole chapter to this.
She does, and one of her most important points is that grief is totally normal. It's not something to be fixed.
That's so important to hear because it's easy to feel like we're doing something wrong when we're grieving,
It's a natural human response to loss. And Dr. Smith encourages acceptance, not avoidance. She even compares it to learning to swim. You take these little dips, step back, you build up your strength over time. You don't just jump into the deep end and expect to be a pro right away.
That's such a great analogy. It makes the whole process feel less scary.
Yeah, definitely. And speaking of scary things, you mentioned feeling anxious about public speaking, right?
Yeah, that's a big one for me.
Dr. Smith clarifies the difference between normal stress and clinical anxiety. Both involve similar physical reactions, that fight or flight response. But they differ in how intense they are and how long they last.
So it's normal to feel butterflies before a presentation. But if those butterflies turn into a full-blown panic attack, that's when it becomes clinical anxiety.
Exactly. And for those moments when anxiety spikes, Dr. Smith recommends a technique called square breathing. Super simple. You can do it anywhere. Discreetly, too. Basically, you just inhale for a count of 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4, hold again for 4.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that. I'm definitely going to try that next time I'm feeling anxious.
It's a great tool to have. Speaking of facing fears, remember you mentioned being scared of heights? Well, Dr. Smith shares her own experience of being terrified on the Leaning Tower of Pisa.
Wow. Did she conquer her fear?
She did. She went up even though she was scared. And her point is, avoiding our fears just makes them stronger. Facing them, even in small ways, that's what helps us overcome them.
So it's like that whole just do it thing, but for our fears.
Yeah, pretty much. She has this learning model where you identify your comfort zone, your stretch zone, and your panic zone.
Yeah.
The key is to push yourself into that stretch zone. The area that feels a little challenging but not totally overwhelming. It's like weight training for courage.
Love it. Makes so much sense. It's about building up that mental muscle gradually, right?
Exactly. And this brings us to self-worth and mistakes,
Yeah.
which, ties back to those feelings of self-doubt you mentioned. Dr. Smith says that the way we talk to ourselves after we mess up, Makes a huge difference.
I'm definitely my own worst critic.
She's not saying that we should love failure or anything, but that drowning in shame just keeps us stuck. Instead, she offers this really powerful exercise called compassionate self, where you write a letter to yourself, but you write it as if it was from a supportive friend.
That's such a cool idea. It's like giving ourselves that same kindness we'd give to someone we care about.
Exactly. It's about switching that inner dialogue from self-criticism to self-compassion.
Wow, this has been so helpful. I already feel better equipped to manage my emotions and deal with those tough situations.
That's great to hear. And remember, this is just the start of our deep dive.
So, we were talking about how mental health info is getting out there more, like on TikTok. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's kind of a mixed bag, right? Dr. Smith even talks about this in the book. On the one hand, it's great that we're finally being more open about mental health. It really helps to break down that stigma that has silenced so many for so long.
It's like we're finally starting to understand that mental health is just as important as physical health, something you've always been passionate about.
Exactly. And platforms like TikTok give therapists like Dr. Smith a way to reach so many more people, sharing evidence-based info, in a way that's engaging and easy to digest.
That's so important, but there's also the risk of misinformation, right? Not everything on social media is accurate or helpful.
That's true.
Yeah.
It's super important to be picky about our sources. And remember, social media can never replace professional help if you need it. It's like you wouldn't diagnose a broken bone based on a TikTok, right? You'd go to the doctor.
Exactly. But those platforms can be a good starting point to learn, find resources, connect with people who understand. Speaking of needing help, Dr. Smith has a whole chapter on procrastination. My biggest weakness, you mentioned you struggle with this too, right?
I think we all do. Dr. Smith has this idea of acting opposite to the urge. Sounds basic, but it's really powerful.
So when I feel that urge to scroll through my phone instead of tackling that big project, I should just force myself to start working, even if I don't feel like it.
Yep. It's about making a conscious choice to do what aligns with our goals, even if it feels uncomfortable at first. Dr. Smith really emphasizes that it's about building new habits, not being perfect.
So even if I only manage 5 minutes of focused work before getting distracted, that's still a win.
Totally. It's like you're creating this new path in your brain. The more you repeat a behavior, the easier it becomes. And, Dr. Smith also reminds us that rest is super important too. You can't be productive 24/7.
Makes sense. Sometimes I feel guilty taking breaks, but it sounds like they're really crucial for staying on track.
Think of it like training for a marathon. Even elite runners take rest days. They don't go full intensity every single day. Rest and recovery are essential, to avoid burning out and to actually achieve peak performance.
Okay, so be kind to ourselves, build those good habits, and celebrate the small victories. Got it. But what about when we're facing huge life changes? You mentioned thinking about switching careers. I can only imagine how overwhelming that must feel.
It can be, for sure. Remember that whole metacognition thing we talked about? Thinking about our thinking? Dr. Smith has a whole chapter about navigating big changes, and she really emphasizes taking a step back to really analyze the situation,
So instead of just jumping into something impulsively, it's more about pausing and really figuring out what's going on in our heads.
Yeah, got it. You mentioned trying journaling before, right? Well, Dr. Smith suggests using it to sort of untangle those messy problems, spot patterns, get some clarity before taking any action.
I love that, untangling messy problems. It's like taking a bird's eye view before making any big decisions.
Exactly. And she has this interesting point about focusing on building the identity of the person we want to become rather than just obsessing over the end goal.
So instead of just saying, I want to be a writer, I should focus on embodying the qualities of a writer, like the discipline, the creativity, the curiosity.
Yeah. It's about shifting from I want to be to I am. The change in mindset can really influence our actions and make the journey feel less overwhelming. And you mentioned how fulfilling it feels to live in a way that's aligned with your values, right?
It's so true. I definitely feel my best when my actions match my beliefs.
That's awesome. Dr. Smith emphasizes that when our goals are rooted in something deeper, something more than just achievement, it gives us this extra motivation and resilience to keep going even when things get hard.
That makes a lot of sense, like building a stronger foundation. But what about when those setbacks and failures inevitably happen along the way? I tend to beat myself up when I make mistakes.
That's where Dr. Smith's message of self-compassion comes in. She has a whole chapter about not letting our mistakes define us. Remember you were saying how you'd never call a friend a failure for messing up?
Definitely not.
Right. She talks about this difference between guilt and shame. Guilt can be a good thing. It pushes us to do better. But shame, that's toxic. Makes us feel like we're fundamentally flawed.
It's like that feeling of wanting to just disappear.
Exactly. Dr. Smith offers a bunch of strategies for dealing with shame and building a more resilient sense of self-worth. One of them is that compassionate self-exercise we mentioned earlier, writing a letter to yourself, but as if it was coming from a really supportive friend.
I love that idea. It's like giving ourselves that kindness and understanding we'd offer to someone we care about.
Exactly. It's about changing that inner voice from self-criticism to self-compassion.
Okay, so be kind to ourselves, even when we mess up. But sometimes it's hard to actually put that into practice. It's easy to say be kind to yourself, but when you're actually in the middle of those negative emotions, it feels impossible.
That's where having concrete tools like the compassionate self-exercise can really make a difference. And remember, you mentioned how much you enjoy helping others.
Oh, yeah. Helping others definitely brings me joy and a sense of purpose.
Dr. Smith has a whole chapter on this, and it's super relevant for you, especially with your desire to support your loved ones who might be struggling.
This is something I've been thinking a lot about lately. I often feel so helpless when someone I care about is going through a hard time. I want to be there for them, but I'm not always sure what to say or do.
And Dr. Smith makes a really important point. She says that one of the most powerful things we can do is simply be present. Just listen with compassion and empathy, validate their feelings, and let them know they're not alone.
So it's more about being a safe and supportive presence than trying to fix their problems or giving unsolicited advice.
Exactly. Remember how you were saying that you wouldn't tell a friend to just think positive when they're going through a hard time?
Oh, definitely not. Toxic positivity at its worst.
Right. It's so much more helpful to say something like, I'm so sorry you're going through this. I'm here for you.
Simple but powerful.
And Dr. Smith also emphasizes the importance of taking care of ourselves while we're supporting others. It's that classic oxygen mask analogy, right? We can't help others if we're running on empty ourselves.
So it's okay to set boundaries, prioritize our own well-being, and ask for help when we need it.
Absolutely. And she suggests making a crisis plan together with the person you're supporting.
Identifying those early warning signs and coming up with a plan of action for if things escalate.
That's a smart idea. It's about being proactive instead of just reacting when things reach a breaking point.
Exactly. Speaking of tough situations, one chapter that really stood out to me was the one on grief. It's something we all go through, but it's often misunderstood. You mentioned you've been dealing with grief lately.
I have, yeah. It's been a rough year.
Dr. Smith's perspective on grief is so insightful. One of the main things she says is that grief isn't linear. It doesn't follow a set timeline. It's not about going through these stages and then just getting over it. It's messy, it's complex, it comes in waves.
She compares it to learning to swim in this ocean of grief, taking little dips, stepping back, and building up your strength over time. Such a powerful image. It emphasizes the importance of patience, being patient with ourselves as we work through it.
Absolutely. And you were saying how you felt like you should be over it by now. Yeah, it's like there's this pressure to move on quickly, but it doesn't always feel that way on the inside.
Dr. Smith makes it clear that there's no set timeline for grief. It can take weeks, months, years, even a lifetime to process a loss. And trying to bury those feelings can actually do more harm in the long run.
Like trying to hold a beach ball underwater. It might stay down for a bit, but it's going to pop back up eventually, usually with even more force.
Perfect analogy. It's healthier to just let ourselves feel those waves of grief, even though they're painful, and find healthy ways to express those emotions.
That makes sense. Like, we have to let ourselves feel it to move through it. What about those stages of grief we always hear about? Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance.
Dr. Smith talks about those too, and she acknowledges that these stages, they were first described by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and they can be helpful to kind of understand the different emotional experiences we might go through when we're grieving.
But they don't always happen in a neat and tidy order, right?
Right. She emphasizes that they don't necessarily happen in a straight line or in a predictable way. Some people might feel some stages more intensely than others, or maybe even skip some stages altogether. It's more like this jumbled mix of emotions than a step-by-step process.
So it's more about honoring our own unique experience instead of trying to fit it into some predefined box.
Exactly. And like with everything, self-compassion is key. Be patient with yourself as you navigate this complex and often painful process.
Good advice. Speaking of emotions that can be tough to deal with, what about anger? I feel like there's this pressure to be calm and chill all the time. But I do get angry sometimes, and then I feel bad for feeling angry.
Dr. Smith reminds us that anger, like all emotions, is a totally normal human experience. It's not about pretending it doesn't exist. It's about understanding it, expressing it in a healthy way, and using it as information.
So it's like anger is trying to tell us something, that something's not right, or that a boundary has been crossed, or that maybe we need to make a change.
Exactly. She gives some really useful strategies for managing anger in a healthy way. One is to notice the physical signs that come with it, like that racing heart, clenched fists, tense muscles.
So pay attention to those body cues before things escalate into a full-blown meltdown.
Exactly. And she also suggests finding healthy ways to release that built-up energy, like exercise, creative stuff, even just taking some deep breaths.
So it's about channeling that anger into something productive instead of letting it control us. What about when someone else's anger is directed at us? How do we deal with criticism, especially when it feels really personal?
This is where Dr. Smith's insights about self-worth and people-pleasing can be really helpful. She's got a whole chapter on dealing with criticism, and she stresses that we shouldn't let it define us. You mentioned that you tend to take criticism pretty hard, right?
Oh, for sure. It can ruin my whole day if someone criticizes my work or something I've done.
And she acknowledges that it's normal to care about what other people think. But she also reminds us that not all criticism is created equal. Some of it can be helpful, even constructive, while other criticism is just plain mean. Or maybe it's just about the other person, not us.
So it's about figuring out which criticism to pay attention to and which criticism we can just brush off.
Exactly. She gives some good strategies for handling criticism in a healthy way. One is to just accept that you're not going to please everyone all the time.
Yeah.
You mentioned you can be a bit of a people pleaser.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I really hate disappointing people.
She talks about how people pleasing can actually backfire and lead to feeling burned out, resentful, and losing your sense of self.
Right, that makes sense. So setting boundaries, prioritizing your own needs, and being okay with letting people down sometimes, that's important.
For sure. Another tip she gives is to reframe criticism as a chance to grow. Instead of getting defensive or taking it personally, we can ask ourselves, is there any truth to this feedback? What can I learn from this?
So take the sting out of the criticism and use it as fuel to improve instead of letting it tear you down.
Exactly. And speaking of self-esteem, one of the most inspiring chapters for me was about building confidence, something so many of us struggle with, and yet it's so important for a fulfilling life. You mentioned wanting to feel more confident, right?
Yeah.
Especially in social situations.
Oh, yeah. Social situations can be really tough for me. And sometimes pursuing my goals feels daunting too. Like, what if I'm not good enough?
Dr. Smith has this really practical approach to building confidence. It's not about suddenly transforming into this fearless, outgoing person. It's about slowly stretching your comfort zone and challenging yourself in small, manageable ways. Remember that weight training analogy. You wouldn't start by lifting the heaviest weight, right? You build up to it gradually, increasing the weight over time, building strength and endurance along the way. Confidence is the same.
I love that analogy. It makes it feel way less intimidating.
And she emphasizes that courage comes before confidence. It's about taking action, even when you're scared. And letting those experiences, both the good and the bad, build your belief in yourself.
So it's about proving to yourself that you can handle those challenges and that you're stronger than you think you are.
Exactly. And remember the weight training analogy. You wouldn't start by lifting the heaviest weight. You gradually increase the weight over time, building strength and endurance along the way. Confidence is the same.
That makes so much sense. It's about celebrating those small wins, those moments where you push yourself and then realize, wow, I actually did that.
Exactly. Dr. Smith also talks about reframing failure. We tend to see it as a sign of weakness, but she encourages us to see it as a learning experience, a stepping stone towards success.
So instead of thinking I'm a failure, it's more about, okay, I learned something important from this experience.
Exactly. And of course, self-compassion is key here too. Be kind to yourself when you mess up. We all do it.
Be your own cheerleader, not your own worst critic, right?
You got it. And she also suggests surrounding yourself with people who support you, who believe in you, and encourage you to go after your goals.
Speaking of goals, lately I've been struggling with finding a sense of purpose, like what's my meaning in life? You mentioned that Dr. Smith touches on this in the book.
She does. One thing she points out is that we're often sold this idea of happily ever after. Like once you achieve this or that, get the dream job, the perfect partner, the fancy house, then you'll finally be happy. But we know that's not how it really works, right?
No, not at all. I think we've all had those moments where we achieve a big goal and then it's kind of anticlimactic. Like, is this it?
Totally. Dr. Smith challenges that whole idea and points out that as humans, we're not meant to be in this constant state of bliss. It's those perfect Instagram feeds that only show the highlight reel. It just makes everyone else feel inadequate.
I hate that. It's so fake, and it sets us up for disappointment.
For sure. Dr. Smith says a fulfilling life includes all those emotions, the good, the bad, and everything in between.
So it's about accepting the whole human experience, the ups and the downs, the joys and the sorrows.
Exactly. She suggests shifting our focus from chasing happiness to cultivating meaning and purpose.
Yeah.
Remember how you said you feel most alive when you're working towards something you truly believe in?
Oh, absolutely. It's not about the destination. It's about that journey and feeling like what you're doing actually matters.
That's it. And she emphasizes connecting with our values, those core beliefs that shape our choices and our actions.
You mentioned that she has exercises in the book to help us figure out what those values are.
She does. Once you know what your values are, you can start setting goals and making decisions that are in line with them.
So it's about building a life that feels authentic and meaningful, not just going with the flow or trying to impress other people.
Exactly. And she talks about finding joy in the process too, not just obsessing over the end goal.
So enjoying the present moment, celebrating the small victories, finding that fulfillment in the process of growing and learning.
Yes. And one final thought I wanted to share is Dr. Smith's emphasis on personal responsibility. We can't control everything that happens in life, but we can choose how we respond to those challenges.
So it's about focusing on what we can control, right? Our thoughts, our actions, our attitudes, instead of dwelling on things we can't change.
You got it. And remember, you're not on this journey alone. We all face obstacles, we all mess up, and we all have that potential to grow and learn. Dr. Smith's book is a great resource for anyone who wants to get better at managing their emotions, building resilience, and creating a more fulfilling life.
I've loved diving into this book with you. I feel like I've learned so much. I hope you have too.
Me too. And remember, this is just the start. The deep dive doesn't end here. Keep exploring these ideas, keep trying out these tools, and keep striving for that more fulfilling life you're searching for.
If you have any questions or thoughts along the way, don't be shy, reach out. We're always happy to help you on your journey.
Thanks for joining